She's also an Italian Jew, so this is going to be the first time I've ever spoken without using my hands. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to introduce many of you to Jewish Voice for Peace and tell you what we're about, and hopefully encourage you to pay attention to nonviolence. JVP is a diverse and democratic community of activists inspired by Jewish tradition to work together for peace, social justice, human rights. We support the aspirations of both Israelis and Palestinians to security and self-determination. As was said, we seek a U.S. foreign policy based on promoting peace, democracy, human rights, and international law, an end to the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, a resolution to the Palestinian refugee problem which is consistent with international law and equity, an end to all violence against all civilians. Our work supports peace activists in Palestine and Israel, and we work in broad coalition with other Jewish, Arab American, faith-based, peace, and social justice organizations. We believe that the U.S. must stop supporting repressive policies in Israel and elsewhere, and that U.S. military aid must not conflict with enforcement of the Arms Export Control and Foreign Assistance Acts, which mandate that U.S. military aid may be used only for defensive purposes within the recipient country's borders, and that aid may not be delivered to countries that abuse human rights. The U.S. currently gives Israel upwards of $3 billion a year in military aid, which actually enables the occupation to continue. It contributes to the devastation of Palestinian society and fosters increasing militarization of Israeli society. We also call for the suspension of military aid to other human rights abusers and occupiers in the Middle East. Israelis and Palestinians both have the right to security, sovereignty, and self-determination within political entities of their own choosing. So we call on Israel to completely withdraw from the occupied Palestinian territories and relinquish all of its settlements, military outposts, and bypass roads within them. We believe Jerusalem must be shared in a manner that reflects its spiritual, economic, and political importance to all Jews, Muslims, and Christians. The history buffs in this room will know that likewise, the UN Special Committee on Palestine's 1947 final report, which enabled the establishment of Israel, called for a UN-controlled territory around Jerusalem. We believe that the diplomatic negotiations between the two parties need to be held unconditionally, and other countries than the US should be involved in the negotiations. Within the framework of an equitable agreement for the Palestinian refugees should have a role in determining their future, whether pursuing return, resettlement, or financial compensation. We believe the parties should equitably distribute water and other natural resources. We agree that Palestinians must stop rocket attacks, suicide bombings, and other attacks on Israeli civilians, and that Israel must cease its use of military force against Palestinian civilians, including attacks involving American-supplied F-16 and Apache helicopters. Moreover, Israel must stop land seizures, destruction of homes, infrastructure, orchards and farms, as well as arbitrary arrests, imprisonments, torture, expulsions, curfews, travel restrictions, abuse at checkpoints, raids, collective punishment, and other violations of human rights. The boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, commonly referred to as BDS, encompasses a variety of tactics and targets. JVP rejects the assertion that BDS is inherently anti-Semitic. And we encourage discussion both within our own community and outside of it about the growing BDS movement. We defend activists' right to use the full range of BDS without being persecuted or demonized. After all, these are the non-violent tactics that have proven successful by Gandhi, Dr. King, Cesar Chavez, and President Mandela. As an organization that focuses on the critical role of the United States in this conflict, Jewish Voice for Peace is deeply concerned by the ongoing activities of U.S. organizations whose nonprofit status enables them to raise money from American donors to support and maintain settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. In the Washington Post last year, David Ignatius noted that between 2004 and 2007, 28 U.S. tax-exempt organizations raised $33.4 million in funding for settlements and related organizations and projects. The construction of settlements, to be clear, in occupied territory is a violation of international law. One of the questions we were asked to address tonight is, who was Rachel Corrie, and are there others like her? Rachel was a student at Evergreen State College, an American member of the International Solidarity Movement. She was killed in the Gaza Strip by an IDF bulldozer while acting as a human shield, attempting to prevent the IDF from demolishing the home of an innocent Palestinian family. The IDF report claimed that the bulldozer driver didn't see her, while several witnesses reported there was absolutely nothing obstructing his view. But the question that's more often asked of activists is, where is the Palestinian Gandhi? The truth is, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of Palestinians using nonviolence to defend their lands and water resources from Israeli soldiers and settlers. These leaders work daily to build a national, nonviolent movement to end the occupation and build peace in the region. Yet, most of you have probably never heard about them. This divide between the facts on the ground and public perception abroad is one of the main reasons why the peaceful Palestinian resistance movement has yet to be successful. So the message I want to end with tonight is the power of attention. The power of your attention in the emergence and development of nonviolent movements in Israel, the Palestinian territories, and elsewhere. What is missing for nonviolence to grow is not for Palestinians to start adopting nonviolence, but for us to start paying attention to those who already are. A quick example is the village of Budros. About 7 years ago, they faced extinction when Israel announced that the continued building of their separation barrier would go through and surround the village. The plan would overtake 40% of the village, and it would cut off their free access to the rest of the West Bank. But truly inspiring local leaders launched a nonviolent resistance campaign which employed hundreds of citizens standing up to the military force and weaponry of the Israeli occupation forces and stopped it from happening. Filmmaker Julia Baca made a powerful documentary film about the effort called Budros. She speaks in her TED Talk about the international media completely failing to cover this extraordinary story. I know, not surprising. But what is surprising is that the movement was successful. After 10 months of persistent, nonviolent protest, the Israeli government decided to move the path of the barrier to the Green Line, which is the internationally recognized boundary between Israel and the Palestinian territories. The resistance movement in Budros has since spread to Palestinian villages across the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Yet, the American media stays mostly silent on the stories. If only the violent acts in Israel and Palestine get covered by the media and get our attention, it makes it very hard for those leading nonviolent actions to make the case to their own communities who live in constant fear of military attack that civil disobedience is a viable option to end the occupation. Of course, as every parent knows, we incentivize activity by giving it attention, creating a functional behavior. We can all play an important role in this conflict by focusing our attention on the nonviolent actors and actions. Every Friday in villages like Belin, Walajeh, and Sheikh Jarrah, nonviolent demonstrations are held. And each week, the protesters are met with tear gas, rubber bullets, beatings, and other violent acts by the occupation soldiers. The way we can support creating peace is by transforming nonviolent resistance into a functional behavior. And we do this by giving a lot more attention to the nonviolent leaders on the ground in Israel and Palestine today. We know that when the film Budros is shown in villages and towns, which are similarly facing being cut off by the separation barrier, turnouts at subsequent nonviolent demonstrations expand greatly. If we don't pay attention to these actions, then they're invisible. But if we do, they will multiply. And if they multiply, their influence and that of their leaders will grow in the overall Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And this is precisely the kind of influence that can actually change the situation. The leaders of nonviolent movements have proven that it works in places like Budros. If we give nonviolent actions and activists our attention, if we demand that our elected representatives and the media do as well, we can prove that it works everywhere. Thank you.